Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 71. Jayant Bhandari is back for his second episode here. How are you today? We're going to talk about world travel and just some places in East Asia and the situation in India and probably the war and the economics around the world, because he's a very worldly man. Thank you. How are you, Giant?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing well. Can you just give a brief bio to everyone who might be tuning in for the first time? Tell them a little bit about what you do and a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I do a fair bit of writing and speaking on issues to do with economics, cultures, societies around the world, Chris. And the reason is I have traveled to close to 100 countries, and to many of those countries I have traveled repeatedly. And I assume that I have a good understanding of what works in the world and what does not work in the world culturally. So I do a fair bit of writing and speaking on these issues. I also help some institutional investors invest in the stock market and in private companies. So I work as an analyst for some of the institutional investors in North America.
Yeah. So yeah, and you're originally from India. You speak English. Just how many languages do you speak?
Just two languages, Hindi and English. Hindi is the language I grew up with. English is the language I learned in the later part of my schooling.
And I believe that's the most spoken language, the most spoken first language in India. Is that correct? I know there's
that's correct. That's the national language of India.
But India has a lot of languages, and many Indians just speak English because it seems to be a unifying language there. So yeah.
Not necessarily. Indians speak English. So if I go to New Delhi and if I talk with someone who speaks Hindi, and I always want to speak in Hindi when I'm in India, it is very likely that the person who is uneducated might not be able to frame a single sentence, would still respond to me in English. English is supposed to be the language which conveys that you are educated and that you are sophisticated. There's a huge amount of a snob value associated with English. So people talk in English for no good reason except to convey to other person how important and how well educated and how sophisticated they are.
You know, I would say the same thing about some Americans who are always using big words. They want to use these 4 and 5 syllable words to show that they're educated. I thought William F. Buckley was horrible with that. He just did that to say, hey, look how smart I am. You use all these big words. I didn't realize that. So there's a lot of, sounds like there's a whole lot of status seeking in India. I mean, you try to portray status as it.
Yes, Chris. Status is one of the most important aspect of any communication, any transaction in that country. People often ask me about the caste system and religions in India. And my response is that if you try to understand Indian caste system or religion or society as a certain kind of a structure, then you won't be able to understand it. India basically has 1.4 billion castes. Everyone is atomized. Everyone is trying to look superior to other people. So every interaction with another Indian requires one person to say sir or madam to the other person. And that is, sir and madam is an essential part of Indian communication. That basically conveys who is superior in that interaction and who is inferior. And that's how important the status is in that country.
Is there always this attitude that if I'm talking to somebody that I'm either supposed to think that I can't just think of that person as an equal. I don't know. I'm either supposed to think of that person as being above me or
Never,
below me.
never works in India. Virtually never works in India. This is funny, Chris. When I go to India, when I fly, I'm very tall, Chris. When I'm on a plane,
Yeah.
I usually help old women and other a lot of other people help with their luggage. Uh, when I come to India, I have to make sure that I stop helping them out because the any help is directly correlated with servant class. So I don't want to be seen as a servant. I have to force myself not to help anyone. But also, you have to stop using words like please and thank you because you demean yourself. You undermine your status by saying please and thank you in that country.
That's wow. So yes. So like you said, you being tall, you can reach up in the compartments on the airplane and help people get things out. But if you do that, you're immediately looked down as a servant. That's wild.
Yeah, and so I sometimes find a midway. If I have to be friendly and is still not be seen as inferior, I prefer a condescending attitude. And a condescending attitude is friendly, but it positions me as a superior, and it is essential because the only choice you have in that country is either to be a superior or inferior. There's no equal status. The thinking is all hierarchical: status, caste, religion. You can try to classify these things whatever way you want, but you will end up being very confused. And this is what this caste classification of India confuses people about. What you essentially has to do to understand is the underpinning cornerstone issue here, which is that people think in hierarchical way, and every interaction is about judging whether you are superior or inferior.
Wow. Where do you think that comes from?
I mean, that has always been the case with India. You can trace it back to 2000, 3000 years back, 4000 years back. There's not that there's much of Indian history. Indians did not believe in writing history. It was after the Muslim Persian rulers started coming to India that history started getting written. A lot of history was found and written by the British. British found many of the lost kingdoms of India. British made it understandable the lost languages of India. So where it comes from is difficult to say, but the situation is very similar to what you see in sub-Saharan Africa. There's no history because people never wrote, people were never curious about the history. So where it comes from is difficult to say, but India never became a civilization until the time that Islamic rulers started coming to the country. That's when India got its first glimpse of what civilization was. Indians were and Indians are tribalistic, animalistic people. They are after resource acquisition. They are after food, money, power, and sex. These are the prime drivers of Indian psyche. And if you have only these three or four things to play around with in your mind, you can come to a very quick conclusion that being in a hierarchical situation is an extremely important, because you have to decide whether you will be exploited or you will exploit. So this is a part and parcel of being a tribal, atomized, animalistic society. Or I might call culture, but it is important to understand that this is not a civilization, and this was the case 1,000 years back, and this is increasingly becoming the case today as time passes by, because remember, the European rulers who came to India have left India 75 years back. So their leadership, their institutions have been hollowed out, have gone away, leaving nothing to give a structure to Indian civilization, Indian society anymore. I wouldn't call it civilization because it's not a civilization.
Yeah, of course the British built the railroads and built the factories, and uh,
Yeah, but Chris, it's extremely important to understand that those are the symptoms. Those are the tip of the icebergs. Railways and roads are important to understand just for the fact that if British hadn't come, there would have been no roads, no railways, no post office, no military. I mean, Indian armed forces are basically British armed forces. They dress like the British armed forces. They fight like the British armed forces. Everything came from colonization. The educational system came from colonization. The missionaries are the backbone of Indian educational system. Without the missionaries, India would have had no educational system. But this is still only the symptom of the tip of the iceberg of what the British created in that country. They tried to convert an animalistic, atomized group of people into a civilization. They brought in manners, they brought in a concept of moral values, they brought in the concept of justice, and they brought in the concept of right and wrong. Because culturally, Indians don't have the concept of justice. Culturally, Indians don't have the concept of right and wrong. And I must say, Chris, that Indians still don't have the concept of right and wrong. A very small elite that had it no longer has the power. They have either left the country or they are at the fringes of the society today. So the mass movement of India is to work exists in a situation where there's absolutely no concept of right and wrong, no concept of justice, no concept of civilization.
and Islam really there's some you mentioned the Muslim civilization. There are some Muslims in India, but they mostly went to Pakistan and Bangladesh, right?
No, I mean, India has the second largest Muslim population in the world. After Indonesia, it is, or maybe Bangladesh has more Muslims, but it's comparable. Um, a lot of Muslims, of course, left for Pakistan and what became Bangladesh. But India has a very large Muslim population. I must say a caveat here that I'm talking about Islam of 1,000 years back. I dislike Islam, Chris. I dislike the way Islam breeds fanaticism today. But what that gives you a perspective on what India was like. Islam, despite being what it is or what it was an improvement on what India was, and that's the only perspective I want to give. I don't want to give Muslim listeners that Islam is something that I look forward to, something that I find enlightening. I don't.
And there haven't really been any other influences since then until the British came.
Well, I mean, that was the transition. It was the Mughal Muslim rulers, Arabic, Persian rulers who came to India, who brought in a concept behind clothing, food, uh, uh, institutions, organizations, structuring society, certain mannerisms. A lot of what mannerisms that Hindus think are their own actually come from Islamic rulers. A lot of dresses and clothing that you hear in Indian in festivities, which Hindus think are Hindu clothing, aren't actually Hindu clothing. They come from Muslims. And that is where you see a lot of similarities between Hindu wedding dressing to Turkish wedding dressings, for example, because they have origination from Islam. So it is important to understand it. But British colonization was a massive change from what Islamic civilization had brought. Uh, there's no, for example, there's no 10 commandments in India. There's no uh, no concept of judiciary in that country. There was no concept of judiciary. Even during the Islamic brought in some concept of it, but it was whatever the rulers decide was going to be the judicial system. There was no written law. It was the law of the man. And even today, this is the law of the man. A policeman does not tell you in India what law he's using to arrest you. He tells you that he's using because his senior is asking him to take you away to the police station, and that's all they will tell you. So the country, the British brought in a major change in the country, a massive improvement over what Islam had brought into the country. Islam was already an improvement. And that improvement continued until 1947. But then everything started to fall apart.
Yeah. Was there some cross between the Hindu and the Muslims? Because I know that the Muslims were excellent mathematicians, and I believe the Hindus developed the whole concept of zero. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I mean, people talk, nonstop about this issue, whether Hindus created the concept of zero. What I like to say is that even if they did, India figuratively and literally created the concept of, created zero. If their contribution to science and technology is zero, maybe, and there's nothing else that they have contributed towards. Islam, in the early part of Islamic changes, Islam was an improvement to the pagan society that existed in the Arabian world. And it was very likely a lot more creative society than it is today. Islam became completely ossified as time went by. Although I have to be very careful when I say that, because I go to several countries in the Middle East, countries like Oman, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and they are really good places to go to. They are in many ways better than the very best you can see come across in the world.
Certainly, that's very interesting. So yeah, you've been to the. So I think we're covered enough. You've been to the Middle East. I've heard good things about Oman, although I don't know very many people who've been there. What do you think of Oman?
Yeah, well, you see, this is where international media gives you a feeling that Islam is one homogeneous civil society. That isn't true. Oman, UAE, and Bahrain can be extremely good places. I mean, I could easily think about living in Muscat or Abu Dhabi or Dubai. They are good places to be in. You have a lot of freedom. They allow you to construct churches and Hindu temples. They allow you to exist in the belief system that you want to believe in. They might not like you to be propagating anti-Islamic thought, and I can fully understand that. This is if the majority, you don't want your society to be shown disrespect by foreigners and even by your own people. I can fully understand that way of thinking. But Muslim world gives you a possibility of a civilization, Chris. So you see, even Malaysia is a decent country. I could live in Malaysia, but the problem is that the Hindu society, and I again don't want to call it civilization. The word keeps coming in on my lips because the world people use the word civilization all the time, but Hindu majority societies have never created a civilization. There is a possibility that Islamic societies can create a civilization. You can look at Mauritius, Fiji, Guyana, Nepal, India, and they are not civilizations. They are feral to wild places.
So the other Hindu majority civilizations are Nepal and.
Well, yes, Nepal is the only Hindu state in the world, and Nepal strangely never got colonized. Now, so Nepal gives you at least a glimpse of what India would have been had colonization of India never happened. If you go to a Hindu temple in Nepal, and unfortunately, as a European seen as Christian, you cannot enter a temple. Most temples, a lot of temples in Nepal, you would get arrested if you tried doing that. I, seen as a Hindu, can enter the temples in Nepal. And I have nothing against it. I think people who don't believe in religion, they're, if you're not a part of a religion, you have no purpose entering the religious buildings. As a tourist, I can still enter because I'm seen as a Hindu. When you go to the temples in Nepal, so many temples are littered with blood, because they still practice animal sacrifices. And that immediately starts telling you the massive kind of improvements that the British brought to the Hindu way of thought and Hindu way of living. What is today seen as the elite Brahmanical ways of life or Brahmanical conduct in India is what I call Christianization of Hinduism. It was Christians and missionaries who brought a change and sophistication to a very small part of Indians, which now many people, having lost this perspective of history, think is originally Brahmanical or originally Hindu. It isn't. They are a product initially of Islam, and they are product of the civilizational values that they have, are a product of Christians and colonizers.
That's interesting. What about Bhutan? And
Chris, I have never been to Bhutan, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about it.
Yeah. So no other Hindu-dominated countries, or just besides Nepal, or?
So Guyana is a Hindu-dominated country. I don't remember exactly the proportion of blacks and Hindus in Guyana.
In South Guyana.
That's correct. Yeah. So Guyana has the president of Guyana is the prime minister, president. The top leader of Guyana is a Hindu Indian, and I think most of the cabinet is Indian. My Guyanese friend tells me that what I tell him about India is exactly what happens in Guyana. And this is interesting because it's the similar kind of tribalism, similar kind of corruption, similar kind of obsequious groveling that you see in India. Happens in Guyana as well. So again, Guyana is not a civilization, extraordinarily corrupt. However, he tells me that there are two major parties in Guyana. Again, I'm no expert in Guyana. I haven't been to Guyana, but there are two major parties in Guyana, according to him. One is a Indian party and one is a black party. And blacks actually have some instinct to fight for their rights. Indians prefer to bribe around and manipulate to get into positions and get favors from the government. So, and look at Mauritius. Mauritius is a lovely island. I have spent a fair bit of my time. I've spent a couple of weeks in Mauritius, and I have walked around the whole island, really. It's a lovely, lovely island, but it's a mess. It's a chaotic mess because whatever India touches becomes a chaos. You can go to the Indian little Indias in North America, and you don't really have to travel around the world, Chris, for that. Go to any little Indias within North America, and you will see that they are actually little India. They smell, they are chaotic. There's no system being followed there. Even when they are not poverty-ridden ghettos, they might be among the richest parts of those cities, but they are chaotic and they smell.
Yeah. Mauritius is down by Madagascar, I believe. It's way down there, right?
That's correct. Yeah, it's sort of, I think, northeast of Madagascar. It's actually still far from the African mainland, but it is still considered a part of Africa. and it's a good hub for flow of money. A lot of money that gets invested in India gets transparency if it goes via Mauritius. So a lot of Indians who want to bring their black money back into India, they use the path of Mauritius. Mauritius gets special advantages if Mauritius company does business with India.
Very interesting. So yeah, so there seems to be. Yeah, I didn't realize Guyana was was that way. I wondered how they got there. If it was prominent, if there are a lot of Hindus there.
It was mostly a product of the British taking Indians for as workers to Guyana, to parts of Africa, to Fiji, to Mauritius. So Indians were laborers for agricultural purposes.
Yeah. Getting back to Oman, I know Oman practices the Abadi school of Islam, which isn't Shiite or Sunni, and that seems like what kind of influence do you think that has on it?
Again, I'm not very good at the religious affairs to do with Oman. I have spent time in Oman. I spend time in there, and I enjoy being a free person there. But that's all my understanding of Oman is actually.
You mentioned Bahrain too, as well. What do you like about Bahrain?
Well, again, I mean, a lot of the Middle East is actually reasonably free for a person like me. I can live life my way, unmolested by either the government or by other people. People are reasonably polite to me, and these countries are extraordinarily free. These are the countries where a 16-year-old girl can go out at 2 o'clock in the night and will not get touched by anyone. So, and they are virtually crime-free countries as well. So those people have done a very good job of organizing their institutions. And what I hear from Saudi Arabia, which is only a small bridge away from Bahrain, Saudi Arabia is now opening up a lot of strict rules. I won't use horrendous rules here, actually, because the Western media portrays as if some of the religious rules are bad, because Chris, we have to really understand it's their rules, and they have evolved those rules for a reason, and I don't want to call them bad rules without fully understanding them. But Saudi Arabia is softening those rules very rapidly. It is a lot, I think cinema halls are opening up in Saudi Arabia. They are now allowing tourists to enter Saudi Arabia. And I know as a fact, because I work for investors, that Saudi Arabia is increasingly encouraging foreign investors to come enter Saudi Arabia and invest. So you can build a negative image of Saudi Arabia because of certain portrayal on CNN or Fox News, or because one journalist Saudi Arabian journalist got killed in Turkey on the orders of some of the top people in Saudi Arabia. Now, those isolated events can leave you with a negative impression of Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is improving. And any society that is improving is a society about which I keep my mouth shut. I want to see improvement and opening continue to happen rather than bitch about it.
Yeah, I certainly hope to see improvement there as well. Yeah, you mentioned. I mean, one drawback to a lot of these countries, though, is I know there's probably some of the hottest countries you've been to.
Yes, I mean, these are extraordinarily hot and also very dusty countries. If you have a desert, if your cities are built on a desert, then your air will have a lot of dust in it. And very dry air as well. So yes, very hot, very dusty. And if they are humid, then they are still hot and humid, which is even worse. So these places are not for everyone. But at the same time, remember that these are, all these hot developed places like Hong Kong, Muscat, Abu Dhabi, um, uh, Singapore are very well air conditioned. You can exist within air conditioning. And also, what is good about these places is that uh, uh, that you can buy a $50 plane ticket to leave the country and go elsewhere. From the Middle East, flying to Europe is only a few hours. It's 4 or 5 hours, and you are well into in Western Europe. And these are very cheap flights. So they have done an extraordinarily good job of developing all these countries as hubs for travelers. So it's great. I fully understand that none of these countries offer you nature and hiking and skiing, but you take a 4 or 5 hour flight and you are in the areas that you want to be.
But Dubai, especially, is very much becoming a business center. I mean, they want to do business with everybody. It's kind of becoming maybe the biggest business center in the world, really.
Well, Dubai is opening up very, very rapidly. So the latest thing is a golden visa that they have come up with, which allows a lot of people now a 10-year visa to live in Dubai. Now, this did not exist until a few years back. So a lot of people who otherwise moved to, IT people or nomads who otherwise moved to, Kuala Lumpur or Latin American countries are starting to look at Dubai as a possibility. Remember, Dubai does not have income tax. The sales tax is, I think, is still only 5% or so. So the sales tax is very low. The government lets you get on with your own life. Yes, Dubai is attracting a lot of businesses now, and it is clearly emerging as a competitor to, let's say, Hong Kong and Singapore. But at the same time, a lot of rich people are also moving to Dubai because their assets are protected in Dubai. So rich people can buy a house and just live there as residents. And ironically, a lot of people, I think if I'm not wrong, the largest proportion of nationality that is actually moving to United Arab Emirates is Indian, because these are the rich Indians who have only 4 hour flight to India from Dubai, and they can protect their assets from the expropriative eyes of the rapacious government in India.
Certainly, yeah. Dubai, of course, is not a country. It's part of the United Arab Emirates, and I believe Dubai is just one of the Emirates. They have, I think, 5 or 6 or something like that.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what the other Emirates are doing, but that's, and of course I've also heard really good things about Emirates Air too. That they're a good airline. So yeah,
well, I mean, they are the best airlines. I mean, all the I can't think of any Middle Eastern airline which isn't in the top 4 or 5. They are really good airlines. The food is excellent. The services are excellent. The airports are excellent. And that is why, and this is not just about UAE, Emirates, and I'm forgetting the names right now, but all those 4 or 5 airlines of Middle East are very good airlines, and the airports are extremely clean and good airports to.
Well, Qatar has a very large world presence, I believe. Qatar Airlines.
Absolutely. I mean, it's again a great airline. I haven't entered Qatar as yet because I don't know if they allow tourists to enter so far, but I have transited through their airport several times, and it's a great airport.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of airport. There's a lot. From what I hear, there's a lot of great airports around the world. Have you spent a lot of time in Malaysia? I mean, I've heard lots of lovely things about Malaysia. I know a lot of American companies go to Malaysia.
Malaysia is an extremely good place. The first time I was in Malaysia was the time when I was living in India. And when I traveled through Malaysia, I was thinking if I was already in a first world country. Malaysia has attracted a lot of manufacturing, a lot of technology companies. The palm oil business in Malaysia is extremely good. Malaysia has benefited hugely from its proximity to Singapore.
Yeah.
Malaysia also offers people certain tax advantages. I know actually a lot of people who live in Malaysia. I have never really gone into details on why they prefer Malaysia, but clearly the cost of living is very good in Malaysia, very inexpensive. It's a reasonably safe country, and the rules are slightly different for Muslims than for non-Muslims. So if you're a non-Muslim, they let you alone mostly, which is great. And they offer you a lot of tax advantages for foreigners and foreign companies.
That's very interesting. I assume most people who do business in Malaysia, they're talking about mainland Malaysia, and not the Borneo portion of Malaysia.
Yeah, when I think about Malaysia, I always think of the mainland Malaysia, the part of Malaysia that's next to Singapore. Again, Chris, let's be let me give you a very good way to understand Southeast Asia. This is something you will never read in academic journals. The quality of growth, development, and civilization and institutions in South Asia is directly proportional to the number of Chinese, the proportion of Chinese in that society. Malaysia is whatever it is because of being spearheaded by its Chinese population. Similar is the case with Indonesia, similar is the case with Thailand, and because Hong Kong and Singapore are predominantly Chinese, with about 80 to 90% Chinese, they are highly developed states. So the spearhead, what drives the growth is the Chinese proportion in these populations. And that is why there's actually, among the natives, there might be a bit of a anti-Chinese feeling, but without the Chinese, nothing happens in these countries. So Malaysia owes, in my view, most of its growth and its stability and institutional system to the Chinese presence.
Yeah, that's certainly something that happens. I mean, it's just like the complaints. Sometimes you'll hear about the Anglo-American oil company comes to Iran and drills oil, and then they want to nationalize the oil company so they can profit from the oil. And well, yeah, but if the Anglo-American oil company hadn't went there in the first place, you never would have found the oil.
Well, this is funny, Chris. I was once in Harare in Zimbabwe, and for whatever reason, I won't go into the details, I ended up with a nephew of Robert Mugabe.
Oh,
so I spent a few days with him, and he was driving like crazy around the city. Police checks did not really matter to him, and we went to several of his houses in that area. And those houses had fleets of cars in them, very expensive cars. And we even visited some of the farms that had been expropriated from the white farmers, but now going feral because they thought, these people think that taking away businesses is all that matters, and somehow these businesses are automatic money generating machines. No, a lot of sweat and labor and blood goes into making that land work as farms. So the expropriated farms became just wild. Nothing grew on them. The expropriators did not know how to do farming. They did not have the frame of mind. It requires a certain way of thinking to produce value. So these people could not really produce any value, and those farms, expropriation of those farms meant that Zimbabwe, which was at one point of time the breadbasket of Africa, became dependent on charity food from other countries.
Yeah, I suppose that was back when it was previously called Rhodesia. Yeah, and
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, do you know a lot about what happened in Zimbabwe or not?
Well, I mean, what I know about Zimbabwe is exactly what happened in India, which is that when Zimbabwe, Rhodesia became independent from European rule, from the British rule, a lot of smart Zimbabweans left for the United Kingdom. In 1947, when India became so-called independent, I don't call it independent because our rulers changed from rational people to colored junkies, brain-dead junkies in India. A lot of people understood what was going to come, so a lot of these smart people left India around 1947. There was almost an exodus of people over the 10-year period between 1947 and mid 50s. Similar thing happened in Zimbabwe. These people recognized what was coming. So those people who think that the freedom fighters of these countries were going to free these societies from the evil colonizers, they are using today's politically correct perspective and projecting it on the past. The reality is that people of those days understood what was happening. It was a power grab. It had nothing to do with the freedom movement. And you have to really understand the so-called freedom fighters of Rhodesia and India and other third world countries from that perspective, that this was a power grab combined with the fact that the British were tired of ruling the world. They had exhausted themselves fighting the First World War and the Second World War. And the political climate of the world under the increasing influence of the US was such that it was just timely and appropriate for them to wash their hands off. And that's what actually happened in these countries. Rhodesia has been a disaster under local native rule. And I would say, except for Singapore, I can't think of any country that has not been a disaster under native control. Latin American countries have continued to go down the drain over, even countries which became free more than 100 or 150 years back, they have continued to go down. The whole of sub-Saharan Africa is an utter disaster. You look at the Vietnam might be a slight exception to the rule, but virtually every third world country has gone down after the colonizers left. So those people who this political correctness has removed so much of wisdom from our understanding of world affairs.
Certainly. Yeah. What you mentioned Vietnam. What about Laos and Cambodia?
So I have been to both the countries. I have traveled in Laos and Cambodia. No, they aren't really doing what. So no, they aren't doing what is happening in Vietnam. Again, it is important to understand that the proportion of Chinese in your society matters. The progress in Vietnam is driven, from whatever I have seen, primarily because of Chinese association. My client and I are well invested in a company, a Hong Kong-based company, which has a major manufacturing facility in Vietnam, and they are increasingly moving their manufacturing from China to Vietnam. Because Vietnam offers them cheap labor, but Chinese labor, which is very productive, and an improving investment ecology. But that isn't the case with Cambodia and Laos, which are still dictatorial in a bad way. This is, there's a dictatorship, there's an authoritarianism of, let's say, China, but there's then authoritarianism of Cambodia, and there's authoritarianism of other dictatorial systems, Belarus, for example, where the viewpoint of the population is never taken into account.
Well, I suppose, yeah, dictatorship. There's also a dictatorship in Burma, which of course is, or Myanmar, as we
Which
should call
Burma is now is rapidly emerging as a suppliers of maids for Hong Kong, Hong Kong and other richer pockets around Southeast Asia, because Myanmar has been a complete disaster. I actually was in Myanmar about 20 years back, and this was a horrible military dictatorship. They have currency bill notes of 9 local units. Now it's so difficult to add numbers up when you have a currency bill of 9 local units or 3 local units, because of some superstitious values the military of Myanmar had. People have, or at least when I was there, had virtually no freedom of movement in Myanmar. Uh, and this is, again, an extraordinary corrupt institution in Myanmar. It has always been, because there's a lot of internal fighting happening in Myanmar. There's not much of enlightenment, much of education in that country. They are building temples all the time. People, instead of doing some work for the society, prefer to build temples. Go to Bagan, for example. Bagan has literally tens of thousands of temples, and they keep building new ones. So it's a very superstitious, backward society, and now all it does is to supply maids to richer pockets, which is such a disaster. It's such a shame that these young girls go abroad to work as maids who could be working and raising a family in their own countries.
Certainly. What exactly do you think China brings that they don't have?
Chris, let's put it this way. There's one book that helped me give a structure to my world travels. And as I said, I have been to close to 100 countries. I have lived in about 7 or 8 countries over extended periods of time. And there's one book that I came across about 10, 15 years back, which helped me connect all the dots into something perceptive. And I use that image in my mind all the time to understand what is happening in the world. Now, that book is primarily about the US, but the subliminal message of that book gave me that understanding. The book is The Bell Curve by Charles Murray. Now, you mentioned those names, and you get canceled in North America today. Everyone should read it to understand. Americans should read it to understand what is happening in America and what will happen to America. But you must understand that Chinese are among the highest IQ people on the planet. Yeah. And that is the key that changes a lot. And that is the reason why Chinese influence becomes an influence for improvement. Now, that does not mean you become enlightened overnight, or your societies perceptively, for American eye, which is which uses a very high measure, a much nicer yardstick to measure other countries. From their eyes, things might not look very different, but a Chinese influence is an influence for improvement in any society.
Okay, I do remember. I did read that book, and I do remember it. It was co-authored with Richard Herrnstein. Herrnstein died almost immediately after it was published, so Murray got all the attention.
That's true. And, he has written a few other books. I have read all those books, and they actually give a very good understanding of the United States and Canada. And I think every North American should read his books, because if you don't understand the ingredients that go into your society, you will not understand why it is what it is and where it is going. So I have to say a million thanks to Charles Murray, and every American should say a million thanks to Charles Murray for the work he did. And again, going back to why China, Japan, Taiwan, why are all Chinese and Japanese majority countries are civilization today, except for North Korea? And that is why I think North Korea, when it becomes free of the current dictator, Kim Il-sung, it will become very rapidly a first world country. And it is the only third world country which has the potential and which will one day become a first world country, but when it gets unleashed from the constraints imposed by the current dictator.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think? What do you think is going to happen with Taiwan in the next few years?
Chris, so I have a very different opinion about Taiwan than a lot of other people have. I think Taiwan should have been recognized as an independent country 40 years back. Hong Kong should have been recognized as an independent country 40, 50 years back. When China was a weak country, when China was facing through its cultural revolution, we did not do that. Okay. And I think Taiwan should be a free country. But today, because of social media and because of the fact that China is now emerging as an extremely strong country, and it will continue to develop, and China will inevitably become the most powerful country at some point of time. I don't know when, maybe by the end of this century, but it is on that path. Because America is doing harakiri because of wokeism, and China is continuing to improve its society. So what happens now is that you American Washington woke bureaucrats who have no experience of real life want to impose democracy on Hong Kong. So what they want to do is instigate democratic movement in Hong Kong, which was actually one of the freest countries on the planet. Hong Kong, democracy has no association with freedom. Hong Kong was the freest country on the planet till about 10, 15 years back. Now you agitate the masses, you agitate the young people to run a democratic movement in Hong Kong, which is what American Washington woke silly bureaucrats did, warmongering bureaucrats. Now imagine yourself being on the seat of Xi Jinping. You sit in Hong Kong, and you sit in Beijing, and you see, and maybe you, Chris, as Xi Jinping would say, "Hey, I want to leave Hong Kong alone. It's a wonderful country to emulate for future Chinese. Is the freest part of the world, and it brings a lot of growth and good connections to China." Now, USZ would be very happy letting Hong Kong be by itself. But with these woke American silly bureaucrats agitating Hong Kongers, the problem is that if you allow, as Xi Jinping, if you allow democratic movement to progress, what would happen? There would be isolated democratic movements emerging in China itself, and China will then start to fall apart. So you, as Chris, a fully libertarian, a freedom-loving guy, sitting on the seat of Xi Jinping would say, "Hey, I have to crush Hong Kong today. If I don't, then I would destabilize China." So unfortunately, these silly American warmongering bureaucrats sitting in Washington did no good to Hong Kong by imposing their democratic views on Hong Kong. Now, democracy in Hong Kong would, even if China had allowed democracy in Hong Kong, it would have resulted into a massive loss of freedom, because democracy today has become a conduit for wokeism to enter any society. Yeah. So democracy would have destroyed Hong Kong as well. Anyway, so from my perspective, China did what it had to do. It had no option left because of this interference in their internal affairs by woke, stupid people who did not understand other cultures. Yeah. Similar thing is happening in Taiwan. You should have left Taiwan alone. Now it's too late to recognize it as an independent country. Just don't agitate China anymore on that thing. And China would let it alone. And the reason is very simple. Chinese are not interested in fighting. This is not the Chinese culture. It's a misprojection of Chinese culture that China wants to assert its authority or power. China, I doubt, wants to do that. China wants economic growth. So China knows it very well that in 50 years' time, whether Taiwan becomes a part of China or not, it will become a part of China because America will have lost a lot of its relative strength compared to China by then, and China would then be able to project its power on Taiwan, which is actually from parts of China visible to the naked eye. So they can go into Taiwan anytime. China was disciplined and sane enough not to take over Macau and Hong Kong, despite that, both of them are just right next to mainland China. They're connected to mainland China. They went through proper negotiations. China, ideally, I don't think wants to acquire Taiwan by force until they agitate the masses so much that China will be left with no other option.
Well, one thing about Hong Kong is Hong Kong was not a democracy, and that's one reason why it was capitalist. I mean, this is what thing happens when you have capitalism and then you have democracy. It immediately pretty soon becomes a welfare state. Were the people you think the people in Hong Kong were protesting for democracy, or were they protesting because they wanted to keep it capitalistic?
No, I have regularly visited Hong Kong, and I spent a lot of time with protesters in Hong Kong in 2019, late 2019s. I was actually right below the Chinese flag. I have a video of it in which Chinese flag was taken down from the government office in Hong Kong and desecrated, and the whole riot police came and threw tear gas on people there. I also saw the earlier, about 10 years back, when the umbrella democratic movement started in Hong Kong. Let me preface it by saying that Hong Kong people are among the most civilized people even today. They are amazingly good people. During all these protests, they recognized that I was a tourist. So they always warned me whenever there was any trouble coming. People would come and protect. So, they would come and say, hey, the riot police is going to throw smoke, the gas on us. So go away. So they are very polite people. But remember that the modern educational system imparts a worldview in people's mind where democracy is supposedly correlated with liberty. So the young people of Hong Kong who grew up in, a good prosperity, better freedom, better economic situation than people in the Western people in Europe and North America did. It started thinking that being a democracy would actually lift their situation even better. Now, in my view, democratic system is the worst system possible. We can discuss on it later if you want to, but they had institutions created by the British, which made Hong Kong one of the best countries, probably in economic terms, in liberty terms, the best place on the planet. Why did you want democracy then? It was a democratic movement, but democracy today is all about welfare payments, transfer payments, and that would have destroyed the freedom and capitalism of Hong Kong.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it seems like to me it was already happening even before the transfer. I had another lady on here, asked her, did you ever, I don't know when you first went to Hong Kong, but did you ever go to the walled city?
Sorry, what is the walled city?
The Kowloon walled city.
Yeah, well, Kowloon is, I spent a lot of time in...
That was demolished, I think, in the early 90s, but it was it was almost complete it was almost completely anarcho-capitalist. Just this whole thing of people.
Oh God, are you talking about that Chung Ching Towers or something?
No, the Kowloon walled city.
Okay, so Chris, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but the first time I was
in
in Hong Kong
Kong.
was so the first time I was in Hong Kong was in mid 90s,
Okay, you might not have seen
1990.
it.
Yeah, I might not have seen it, but there was I can't remember the exact name of those that massive building that existed in Cologne, which was there was everything happening in those buildings, and it was cockroaches, rat, there's
I think
dirt, there's
that's what I think. I think you got it. Yeah, I think that's. It wasn't just one building though; it was a bunch of buildings just built on top of each other. The way it.
Yeah, that was, and I think literally tens of thousands of people lived in that small area. But this is what makes certain countries very good. These countries in the Middle East, in Hong Kong, Singapore, they are truly a free market where you get what you deserve, and it creates a sort of racial section, ironically, but you can have salary levels as low as $300 a month to a GDP per capita, which is among the highest in the world. So you can imagine the difference between the lowest salary and the highest salary. It's massive in these countries because they allow the economics of their societies to give you a remuneration which is appropriate for your productivity rather than what is now increasingly known as survival money or welfare payments. They don't do all those things.
Certainly, yes. So yeah, we kind of danced around it. You don't have any opinion on where Pakistan and Bangladesh are going, do you?
Oh, I have a very clear opinion on on where Pakistan and Bangladesh are going. I think, as I said earlier, that among the third world countries, those who had the possibility and potential to become second world are already second world, and among that, China is the only country which has a potential and possibility to become a first world country. And I have repeatedly, over extended period, been in China. I love that country. I love the progress that's happening. Every other third world country, all of the Latin American countries, whole of Africa, most all of South Asia, the Indian subcontinent will end up in a disaster. They will fragment and fall apart into tribal units the way they existed before European colonizers came. Same will be the situation with Pakistan and Bangladesh eventually. Now, Pakistan is already well on that path. Pakistan's currency, I think, has fallen by 40 or 50% in the last 1 year or so. Their economy is in a complete crisis. The society is disintegrating in Pakistan. So will be the case in India as well. India will fall apart over the next few years because India is behind Pakistan by about, I would say, 20 years in terms of fanaticism. Just yesterday, a principal of a big Christian school in the city of Pune was badly beaten up because they had a morning prayer which used "Oh Lord," which in the minds of the Hindu fanatics somehow referred to Jesus Christ. So this guy was beaten up for this. So fanaticism is very rapidly rising in that country over the last 30 years, and it will continue to rise. There's nothing to stop it now, because even America, which used to be a moral force to stop events from happening, or at least which made public comments about bad things happening in these third world countries, no longer does that. So Pakistan is already a disaster. It's falling apart. India will fall apart over the next few years. Bangladesh actually, ironically, is improving right now because Bangladesh is not a full democracy. It's a controlled democracy. and they have been relatively sane in terms of their economic policies. But Bangladesh is sandwiched between India and Myanmar, two disaster zones. So Bangladesh will improve over the next few years, and it is. I'm very happy. It's the best part of apart from Sri Lanka, it's the best part of Indian subcontinent. But it will eventually have no future either.
Yeah. It sounds like you've said good things about Sri Lanka in the past. What do you think about Sri Lanka right now?
Well, I was in Sri Lanka early last year. I spent 2 or 3 weeks in Sri Lanka. It's a lovely country. Again, Indians like to. There is a strange, because Indians don't really travel. They don't really want to understand the world. It is now believed by Indians that India is the only emerging part of Indian subcontinent, and Western media and Western politicians want to imbibe in your mind a feeling that India is just this great nation. I mean, if you notice what was happening in the US when Modi visited the US a few days back, you saw all the fawning that takes place. But it's easy to understand the difference between Sri Lanka and India. Sri Lankan GDP is between 50% to 100% higher than Indian GDP per capita.
Yes.
Sri Lanka is a heaven compared to India. Sri Lankans come out to fight for their rights when the time really goes bad. Indians never ever come out to fight when they are exploited. So just because Sri Lankans come out to fight does not mean Sri Lankans are worse than Indians are. The social instability of Sri Lanka is actually a symptom of an underpinning positive aspect of Sri Lanka, which is a righteous indignation some of those people have. I could any day live in Sri Lanka, Chris. I would never, ever live in India. India is a complete, total hellhole.
One thing that's interesting, though, and talking about India, is a lot of Americans are very enamored with India. This is especially the case. I mean, I know a lot of people who are, in various conscious communities, or they're pursuing spirituality and mindfulness, and looking back, with George Harrison going to India and talking about how great India is, and even having a song, where he says lyrics like Hare Krishna and stuff like that. There's especially
George Harrison is the Beatles guy.
Yeah, George Harrison of the Beatles.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Right. Certainly when he was quite. There's always been a fascination, especially among so-called educated Americans, with India. Not really sure where that comes from, but it's very, very interesting, and yet, not to mention, big tech loves. I mean, if all these big tech companies in America could ship everything off to India, they would.
Yeah, so you probably can go back to 50s and 60s to understand this romanticism to do with India. And actually, this has a lot to do with Maharishi Yogi and Beatle Association, and then people like Madonna started practicing yoga, and started having a lot of Hollywood celebrities started having Indian gurus as their spiritual leaders. India is a feral place, and for a person raised in constrained civilization within the constraints of 10 Commandments, might find India a very liberating place, because you can do anything you want. You can do drugs. You can pay cheap money to find women there. Alcohol is cheap. The food is cheap. And drugs are available in that country. So you can, or used to be very easily available compared to what was the case in the US. So India was romanticized primarily by hippies and Hollywood celebrities. Yes. Now, these are not the yardstick to measure civilization. They are not the spokespeople for what civilization are. these are hedonistic people. Hippies and the Hollywood people are hippies, and they are civilization destroying people. So from their perspective, India might have been a very, they created this romantic image of India. Now, also remember that these people take first class flights, business class flights to India, and they stay in 5-star hotels. Now, Indian GDP per capita is about $2,000 per capita, which is less than that of sub-Saharan African GDP per capita. So actually, Chris, for all intents and purposes, sub-Saharan Africa is a better place, believe it or not, is a better place than India is.
Yeah.
Except for this romantic image created by Hollywood and hedonistic hippies of the Western society. But also another change that happened in India was that in early 90s, Indians spoke more English than any other country apart from America and the UK. So, and those were the days when in information technology, all you needed was someone who could speak English and had a warm body. You did not really understand much about software programming or technology. So Indians found a niche there, and telephony suddenly improved over the late 80s in India. So India was just there at the right time for IT industry. But again, remember, Chris, Chinese IT industry is 5 or 6 or more times bigger than Indian IT industry. And Indians, most of the work that Indians do is back office, low level clerical IT work. And that is the future of that is very limited. There's another angle to that, Chris, and which is that Indian lobbies in the US are very strong. Indians are among the most well-paid people in the US. So they contribute to these lobbies that create a good image of India, despite, again, that India is among the poorest, least free places on the world. And these people have left India, but they want to attach their identity to India. So they find it very important to glorify India. The question always is, in my mind, why did you leave India if India was such a good place? So I would always ask American Indians who are very proud of India, why did they leave India, or why don't they return back to India if they are if they think so highly of India?
Well, yeah. Well, that's a tendency also just to romanticize about where you grew up. I mean, you could ask me, why did I leave my hometown? But if I hear somebody else say something negative about my hometown, I'll start defending it.
Well, not necessarily, Chris. A lot of Europeans who moved to America had a clear, unclouded opinion about why they left Europe after the Second World War, or historically to the US. They wanted liberty. They knew it. You talk with East Russians and Ukrainians in Canada and North America and the US, and they will tell you that they find Ukraine and Russia to be oppressive, and that's the reason why they are in North America. Same with Hungarians. So you can decide to be partly honest, or you can decide to be fully dishonest and lie completely, and which is what happens with Indian lobbies in the U.S.
Well, what's also interesting too is often you'll sometimes it's the kids. The Indians immigrate to America. They build a family in America, but then their kids are fascinated, even though their kids have never been there.
Well, which is actually across the board a problem. The first generation that moves into the West has gratitude in its mind, and it still understands where it came from and where it has come to. Whereas the second generation does not have any anchors that the first generation has. And as the second generation is less kind to the hosts, the crime rate of the second generation actually worsens. Those people who think that the second generation and the third generation gets more assimilated is actually completely wrong. They actually gets less assimilated than the first generation is, except for the fact that second and third generation is likely to speak English better and likely to dress up the Western ways more than the first generation. But those are only the superficial aspect. In terms of the worldview, in terms of the spiritual content of their thinking, the second and third generation actually is worse than the first generation.
And I wonder too, though, do you think maybe that has something to do with all the masochism and the self-hatred that's going on in the West right now? I mean, the way that Western intellectuals just completely hate the West. Would it be different if Western intellectuals had integrity?
Yes, but also, Western intellectuals are still there. I mean, you really have to differentiate between intellectuals who are in a position of intellectual seats or people who are actually intellectual. They all are, I don't think Western people have lost their intellectual people, but those intellectual people have lost the seats that they are deserving of. Democracy has removed the most deserving people from their seats and brought in masses to those seats. And that is where I think UAE or Bahrain, Oman, East Asian countries have done an excellent job, because they are either not democracies or they are controlled democracies. And the problem also is, Chris, that once you have democracy and once you have a proportion of your voters as foreigners, those foreigners act as swing votes. So, for example, Indians are a big swing vote in California, in New Jersey, and many other places. So, although they are still very small proportion of the total population, because of the swing nature of the vote in a democratic environment, it makes sense to pander to them. That's why East Asian countries and again Middle Eastern countries keep themselves homogeneous, at least in terms of giving away passports.
But I mean, let's say you've got that child of immigrants who's really smart, grows up and then he or she goes to Harvard and is constantly bombarded with capitalism is evil, America is racist, the West is evil. I mean, what would happen if that kid went into that school and instead was extolling all the virtues of Western civilization and all the things that Western civilization accomplished?
Yeah, I mean, we have destroyed our institutions in the Western society because of democracy. We have created an anti-meritocracy. That's why I think democracy is the worst system possible, because it's upending. It's an inversion of meritocracy. The lowest 50% people decide who becomes your ruling class. Now, in which other profession you let the least competent people decide on who should be the professionals in that area? So democracy enables the worst of the society, not worst. Sorry, I shouldn't be using the worst. Least competent in public policy to decide who should be running the society, and then it puts in motion a vicious cycle for the society, particularly when you are not homogeneous. Because in a homogeneous society, you can't really go, ask for things like reparations or, there's a stupid thing called diversity, inclusion, and whatever the equity, because then you would be homogeneous, as is the case in Japan and Taiwan and China. They don't have a concept of But so a democracy mixed with heterogeneous society, as is the case now in Europe and North America, is a horrible cocktail.
Certainly, yeah. We didn't get to. Well, what do you think about South Korea and Mongolia, for example? Talk about some other countries in Asia.
Chris, I think that what is today or until today was seen as the Western society, the West Europe and North America, is going to be what East Asia will be seen as 15 or 20 years from now. East Asia or much better actually. East Asia is continuing to improve. East Asia has decided to stay homogeneous. they don't give out their passports to foreigners. They don't accept refugees. South Korea, even today, is 99 or 98% ethnically South Korean. Uh, so, Chris, here's a problem with France, for example, today, that if you say who are the writers of the recent events in France, the statistics says that 90% of them are French and 10% are foreigners. Now, this is a misleading information, because anyone who has citizenship is deemed to be French in that statistics. Whereas most of the riots are, from what I understand, conducted by Muslims and African immigrants to France. East Asia is racially homogeneous, culturally homogeneous. That makes it so they don't have to pander to the minority, because the minority does not become the swing vote in those countries. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, Singapore, Hong Kong are continuing to improve. Currently I'm in Tokyo, Chris, and I tell you, I visit Hong Kong quite often, and people who left Hong Kong over the last 2-3 years are returning back to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong hasn't been a disaster they thought it would be. The same thing happened in 1997 as well. A lot of Hong Kongers left Hong Kong thinking that Hong Kong would become a communist hellhole. It never became a communist hellhole. Hong Kong continued to become a better place even after 1997. East Asia will have its hiccups, will have its road bumps, but East Asia, to me, is a place which will continue to improve over the next many decades, and will become a better place than the Western society, at least materially. And I like to spend a lot of my time in East Asia these days.
Yeah. Do you think a heterogeneous society is necessarily going to fall victim to woke ideology?
Not necessarily, but here is the problem. So look at Canada and North America. It
Yes.
was actually a heterogeneous society. It came from these people came from all over Europe,
Yes.
from all over East Europe and Europe. You don't have a problem as long as you can ignore, and if you can don't let your tribal, racial, religious affiliation dictate your thinking. If you can come out of your animalistic, tribalistic way of thinking, then you can. A heterogeneous society is perfectly fine, because then you would no longer be associating with people based on their race or religion or whatever else. But here is the problem. West Europeans can think that way, because an enlightenment happened in West Europe, where they got into a way of thinking in which they could consider people to be equal. They were compassionate and tolerant. A certain kind of culture evolved in West Europe. But that isn't the case elsewhere. That isn't
Sure.
the case in the Middle East. That isn't the case in the Third World.
Yeah.
So heterogeneous societies and people from those areas, when they come to America or Europe, they don't fundamentally change with time. Even after generations, they don't change, because they stay tribal. And that is the problem.
Yeah, tribalism is a problem. I mean, of course, and capitalism discourages tribalism, but socialism encourages it. And if you're promoting more socialism, you're going to have more tribalism, because membership in a group is what matters. One thing we haven't touched on either, though, is do we see a lot of feminism in these countries?
So if you thinking in terms of modern feminism, and I think, again, these are very flaky words in a way. Women should have freedom. Women should have equality. Women are, equal human beings, and that's how they should be seen as. But today, feminism has changed its meaning completely. Now they should be given priority, and that is what equality in their mind means. Even a small a public listed company today must have a female board of director. All these positioning based on genitals has become so important. Now, to me, that is not feminism, that's anti-feminism, that's against women, because it considers women to be so weak that they would not reach higher positions unless they were supported by men, which is so convoluted, but you have to have really low IQ to add this concept of die together. But anyway, my view is that there is a division of labor among the two sexes. And the third world countries, ironically, contrary to popular conventional wisdom, is actually matriarchal. And women actually in the third world countries have a very strong presence in their families, presence that patriarchy reverses in the Western society. And I think for stability, for civilization, for good institutions, patriarchy is an important element. So these are very feminist countries, and men in a lot of these countries are what I would call cucks. They are subservient to women, and they subservient, again, that is not being equal, which is a reason, one of the reasons for the disasters of the third world. But there's a lot of things which are synonymous to similar way of thinking, which leads to disaster in the third world.
Yeah, definitely. In what ways are the third world? So you think the healthy West was more patriarchal?
Yes, I mean, listen. There's a concept of warriors. It's the job of men to go and fight. I don't want women to be in. Maybe an isolated woman is stronger than most men, and I'm all for that woman. If she wants to go and fight in the army, that's perfectly fine. But mostly. Women are physically weaker. So there's a concept of honor, there's a concept of warrior, there's a concept of leadership, which is supposed to be the part of more of men, because men go through that experience more than women go through. If you have to go and fight, then it will mostly be men, and they acquire the competence. They're more likely to acquire competencies of leadership and warrior. So I can fully understand. And then you have this thinking about protecting your women and children. And, as a result, what you see in historical Western society is a huge amount of respect for women, more respect for women than you see in the third world countries. Now, the low position of women in the third world countries mostly come from senior women. So, for example, burqa is imposed not so much by burqa, the black garb of Muslims. It's not imposed so much by men in the Middle East. It's imposed by the women in the Middle East. And so it is women who create a suffocating environment for their women. As a result, what you have in the third world is, and the blame often, of course, under this new feminist revolution goes to men, because everything is presented in passive language. So the people who are inflicting the violence against women is seen as passive language without identifying who they are, but they are mostly women.
Very interesting. So with these societies being matriarchal, I mean, you don't think there's any way some of these third world countries can correct themselves?
No, there's absolutely no way. So, Chris, I'm perfectly mindful of the fact that today in America, the research organizations across the board are extraordinarily optimistic about India. They think India is now going to take over the world. It isn't going to happen. India will fall apart over the next few years. The third world will fall apart the next few years, except for North Korea. North Korea will, of course, fall apart, but it will then thereafter become a first world country very quickly. No, there's nothing. There's nothing to redeem the third world. And the problem is the basic unit of the third world, which is the citizen of the third world. The third world citizen is driven by resource acquisition. His interest is in this evening's dinner, if at all. Probably he's only interested in this afternoon's lunch, and he doesn't care about the dinner. He does not think about tomorrow. So if he can rape today and go to prison tomorrow, he does not worry about prison tomorrow. He will rape today. He does not save for tomorrow, and that is what you see in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa. There's no concept of saving, from what I see. In India, it's the same. They are hedonistic as a result. They are driven by the material. They are materialistic people. The third world people are primarily materialistic people. They have no concept of philosophy. If I talk ideas, like what we have been discussing for a while today, Chris, if I talk these things with anyone in India, I think I probably know 3 or 4 people in my whole lifetime in India with who I can discuss ideas and philosophy. I can find 30 people at Atlanta airport in one morning who would be happily interested in talking philosophy. So that is the kind of differences between the third world and the first world. There's no concept of ideas and philosophy in the third world. So they have no concept of the future, no concept of organization, no concept of improving the society. They are self-serving, they are self-centered, they are amoral people. They want to acquire wealth through hook or by crook, because they have no concept of moral values. They have no concept of right and wrong, and this is true across the board in the third world.
Yeah, well, what it sounds like to me, is you've got a case of very high time preference versus very low time.
And it's the same thing. It's the same thing, because the high time preference comes from the fact that you have no concept of ideas. You don't think about tomorrow. A lot of these things are synonymous, as I said: resource acquisition, hedonism, high time preference, no interest in ideas, no moral values, no concept of justice, power over others, the caste situation. These things are all synonymous in a way, because they are all underpinned by an extremely materialistic way of living, a very animalistic way of living.
Yeah, and even really no concept of what you're going to leave for your kids.
No, actually, this is funny. Chris, when I first arrived in the UK in 1991, that's when I was shocked to find that I thought, wow, this is what families are supposed to be like, because I hadn't seen the concept of families in India. Now, again, the hippie culture, the hedonistic Hollywood people have created this romanticized image of families in India. Sorry, there's no concept of families in India. What I saw as loving couple or a good, a decent relationship between parents and children was something that was completely unknown to me. And I tell you, Chris, and I'm not exaggerating, I come from among the best families in India. Among the richer families, and among the people who are supposed to be the most civilized. But even there, I did not have the understanding of the family structure that I saw in the United Kingdom. So again, the conventional wisdom is so erroneous in its understanding of the world.
Certainly. I mean, I don't know. So you don't think there's any way that you can change a culture and increase and make people more low time preference? I mean, maybe something like Bitcoin.
So remember, there was a philosophical revolution that started happening in Europe and Rome and Greece about 3,000 years back, 2,500, 3,000 years back. Yeah. And it took it about 2.5 millennia to get to the Renaissance and Reformation times. Now, the third world hasn't even started getting to what Greece and Rome was 3 millennia back. So let's understand that thing. European colonizers and missionaries did a lot of hard work. I mean, missionaries were truly charitable and compassionate people. They wanted to change Africa. They wanted to change India. They wanted to change Latin American countries. They devoted their lives on these people. They never returned back. They left Sweden and England and Holland, and they never went back because they wanted to devote their lives to these pagan heathen people. They wanted to create moral consciousness among these people, and they worked. So you have seen the impact of those 300 years. Not much has changed in those 300 years. These third world countries, the foreigners, the missionaries, the colonizers made a very, very small difference to these people. And I have seen a reversal over the last 50 to 70 years since the departure of the British, since the departure of European colonizers. So these people are reverting back to their original shape. So now when you ask me a question, what is the hope of these people ever waking up? The answer is maybe 3 millennia if they start now, but it isn't happening before 3 millennia. So, and you can't really project anything over the next 3 millennia. So you can be absolutely sure, Chris, that things will continue to degenerate, not only stagnate or improve slightly, but will continue to degenerate across the board in the third world. Now, you can have some positive improvement in places like Bangladesh for a while, but the larger third world will continue to degenerate and worsen with time, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing to redeem it. And again, I might go back to a statement I made earlier about Chris Murray and the bell curve, that IQ matters. And the problem with these countries, the third world countries, is that you can't even train them to be proper maids. The reason why people in Hong Kong and the maids that come from Hong Kong are primarily from Philippines and Malaysia is because from what I understand, they failed to train Indians to be maids. And I tell you my own experience in India. If I want my maid to wash a cup properly, I can absolutely guarantee there will be thumbprints all over, and she can't see them, she can't remove them.
Yeah, it's hard to say. We didn't get onto this. What do you think is going to happen with Russia and Ukraine? What's your opinion on what's your take on that right now?
Again, it's hard to know, Chris. The media gives you a perception that Russia is losing, but a lot of people I know who understand things probably better than me, they tell me that Ukraine is losing. So, there's a propaganda war happening on both sides. I trust neither of those. I don't really fully understand. No one really knows what's happening on the real ground situation is. But whatever way you look at it, Chris, if I look at the 30,000 feet view of Russia and Ukraine, both these societies were on a suicidal path anyway. Ukraine has been known as one of the most corrupt places on the planet. It was seen as it was actually the poorest of the European populations. I think maybe Albania is poorer than or comparable to Ukraine, but Moldova, Ukraine, they are among the poorest places in Europe, East or West Europe. So their populations were on suicidal path anyway. Too much of alcoholism, not enough babies. So the future of Ukraine and Russia, irrespective of what is currently happening, wasn't too good anyway.
Well, they're both very corrupt. Their corruption indexes are both some of the worst in that part of the world. I mean, it's just. Do you think there are any? I agree that a lot of outlets are pushing their own agenda. And do you think anybody's unbiased on this? I mean, maybe Al Jazeera or is anybody unbiased on the situation?
I have, again, Chris, traveled to close to 100 countries. I've lived in about 7 or 8 or 9 countries. And I always try to correlate what I experience living in those countries and what the media informs me about those countries. and there's so much of craziness in the two. There's so little correlation, and not just because they want to propagandize people, but because they perceive the local culture from their foreign eyes. It just creates a huge amount of problems, and they project what they think to be good as and using that as the basis, they want to concoct a story about of those societies. So it's very hard to trust anyone. You have to go and visit these places yourself, and there's no easy way out. So that is why I refrain from judging the war between Ukraine and Russia. I think the war is started because Ukraine and the Western people were on the wrong side, probably. But I still use the word probably because I'm not I've not gone through everything possible on this subject, so I refrain from having a very black and white opinion on this situation.
Yeah, there does seem to be Russia does seem to be one of the few places that's rejecting a lot of the suicidal tendencies of the West, though. I mean,
so Chris, I completely agree with that. East Europe and Russia are rejecting wokeism, and I commend them for that. Now the question is, are they rejecting these wokeism for the right reason, or they are rejecting it for the wrong reason? And I have sometimes I think that it might be for the wrong reason. They might be, for example, and I'm not sure, they might be actually transphobic. They might be homophobic. Now, I don't want to have pride parades in my society. Yeah. I think they are ugly. I don't want naked men or naked women should be dancing with children. I don't think you should be sexualizing kids. So I want people to be able to do what they want to do, but at the same time, I don't want to encourage pedophilia in my society. What is actually happening in Russia, and I can be again wrong here, is that they might actually be transphobic, they might be homophobic, as a result of which they might be against wokeism, but then it would be for the wrong reason, not for the right reason.
Yeah, well, one of the dogmas of the woke ideology is that you either are intolerant or you have to celebrate something. I mean, it's like, for example, I don't celebrate Indian Independence Day, but I still tolerate Indian Independence Day. But there's this attitude, well, you're not celebrating it, so you must be intolerant.
Yes. So Chris, I have my views on what's happening in the world, and I have been cancelled. I was cancelled from a conference last year in Frankfurt because they don't agree with my views, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, I cancelled companies that participate in that conference. So there's this. There's a war between intolerant people who want to teach tolerance to you, which is such a crazy concept. But because they are usually low IQ people, that they can't understand that they are being intolerant of other people. But Chris, fundamentally, wokeism is nothing but elevation of the lower class to the positions of power. That is what wokeism is. It is the elevation of the vast masses, bread and circus masses, through democracy to positions of power, because their vote asserts the policies of the top leadership today. And as a result, you have Trudeau and Biden and Harris, the woke people, as rulers of our societies today. And I tell you, Chris, woke culture is no different from feral culture of the third world countries. They are actually very compatible. They are very similar. And that is why you can actually start to correlate the hippie culture, the romanticism of Beatles, of India, the so-called spirituality that the gurus have brought to the West, and all this yoga. As long as they are stretching exercises, it's perfectly fine. Yeah. But they subliminally destroy you and convert you into subjective pagan thinking. And that's a disaster they have brought to the West. And they are and they are very similar to the woke people today. Where everything is allowed. Now, yes, everything is allowed in India. And, it looks very cute, allowing everything. You can have OGs, you can have free sex, you can have promiscuity, you can have hedonism. But, once you open the gates, the flood water will eventually come in. What is currently happening within a higher, wealthy, prosperous Western society is that wokeism does not look as cruel as it is. But you allow this thing happening over an extended period of time, pedophilia will become extremely common and accepted, which it is in let's say Indian subcontinent at least, which is called bacha baji. Sodomizing young boys is no problems. Even today at virtually every police station, and I was a witness to one just over a year back, sodomizing and sexually exploiting children by the police is just a war loot. It's not a problem, and you can go all to the very top with evidence, and nothing matters in these countries. So pedophilia will become extremely common. And while within the ecology of the Western, prosperous, institutionally strong Western society, wokeism and BLM can look nice and cute for a while. But the path, the second order and higher order effect of these movements will be such that you will become increasingly feral. You will look increasingly free from a certain mindset, from a Christian or Islamic mindset, but you will increasingly become feral, savage, and eventually barbaric. And you will then be eating brains of your enemies, literally eating brains of your enemies, which is what happens in the third world. So wokeism is nothing but the third world depravities. They are certainly on their path, and the mindset is 100% the same as the third world depraved, degenerate thinking.
Certainly, yes, the depraved third world thinking. I agree, though, the woke is basically feral. It's just destruction for the sake of destruction. And I mean, one reason why I think one reason why I may be I have a much more positive opinion of South America, and you consider South America part of the third world, but at least there, the women are more civilized there than they are in America.
Well, Chris, let me just expand on something I said earlier, which is that the Southeast Asian countries are institutionally and economically strong to the extent that they have a certain proportion of Chinese in their societies. The reason behind what is happening in Latin America, the reason behind whatever is institutionally and culturally is still good about Latin America is because of the European control over Latin American countries. And I'm talking about ethnically European control over those societies. So you can is straight away correlate that among the best countries in South America is Argentina, which is still, which has probably the highest proportion of ethnic Europeans in that society. Now, they have also, as a result, they are better societies. But remember, as they become more prosperous, they will actually become increasingly woke. And America used to, until very recently, provide the constraints that on Latin America from becoming too woke or too leftist, because America provided the moral force or moral fear for these people. That fear is going away. I spent a couple of months in between Argentina and Chile later last year, and I think what I've seen as compared to my earlier visits was that these countries are becoming rapidly woke. Chile is extraordinarily woke today. It looks like a burnt down country today. So I think these countries will become woke very rapidly. They did not, because probably of a wrong reason, because they were more macho than earlier, and they probably disliked wokeness for the wrong reason. But because wokeism is becoming a force of nature today in the supposedly enlightened eco space, that the world which is not properly underpinned by philosophy and concrete civilizational values will fall apart and will become woke very rapidly and eventually savage and barbaric.
Well, wokeism has always started with the college professors, no matter where it is. I mean, it's never although sometimes the masses, some people who represent the masses pick it up, but that's where it starts.
Well, they certainly provide wokeism an intellectual, a fake, a pseudo intellectual um, uh, 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 text. And I agree with that. Academics are known around the world historically for being naive, for being simplistic, because they went from their schools, from mommy's lap to schools and to the Ivy League colleges and then to academics. If you don't have a real
Yeah.
life experience, your thinking will always be simplistic and naive. And that's what a lot of academics are. But remember, historically, the political leaders were supposed to be taken out of normal successful people from the society. That is no longer the case. The bureaucrats today are professional bureaucrats who have no real life experience except for telling you how to live your life. Uh, Earlier, bureaucrats were taken out of the society based on their accomplishments.
Yes.
And academics, people who taught in universities, were people who were successful in what they did. And that might still be true with certain physics departments or certain mathematics department. But universities have become they are no longer about what universities are supposed to be about. We now have these stupid educational education about gender studies and whatever bullshit they have come up with. So 98% of universities is not supposed to be there anyway.
That's definitely the truth. I mean, it's definitely become an institution where they're educating agitators. Not to mention, too, I think a lot of college professors more and more are coming from the, just kids who had everything given to them. I don't think they know what it's like to live in poverty. I mean, and let's face it, anybody who's never left America does not know what poverty looks like.
Well, Chris, you can actually go to the ghettos of America. What I have seen among people is that they sort of live in their gated communities. They, go and walk around the ghettos of America, and you can actually experience what poverty and crime is all about. But they want to sit in their gated communities and project, and then lock their cars from inside when they drive through ghettos, and then they say, "Hey." And they talk about then they do all the virtue signaling. There's a kind of hypocrisy that is increasingly growing. All these rich left-leaning woke politicians and bureaucrats of North America, they send their own children to Ivy League colleges and among exclusive private schools. But then they complain about those people who want to protect their children from going into ghetto schools, for example. So
Certainly.
I think you can learn a lot if you gave up on hypocrisy.
But I was saying that even the poorest people in America are better off than a lot of the poor people in India.
I would put it slightly differently. I would rather be a poor person in America. I would prefer to be a janitor in America than be a billionaire than in India, because I was actually, Chris, an extremely well-paid executive. I was working for a Swiss company in India. I was extremely well paid, but I had no freedom. I had to, the only thing that worked was bribes. I had to accompany people I abhorred. I disliked completely. I had a visceral dislike for these corrupt and venal people. And I had no freedom of movement because without a chauffeur, I couldn't go anywhere because the traffic is so chaotic. The train services don't exist. The flights are hardly ever there. and my passport was a Mickey Mouse passport, which did not allow me any traveling privileges. So I would rather be a poor person in America than a billionaire in India. And I'm saying it literally because I went through a lot of, I was a rich guy in India.
Yes, I see what you're saying. You know, I should have brought this up sooner, but getting back to, kids of Indian immigrants in America, do you have any opinion of Vivek Ramaswamy?
Oh yeah, I've heard this guy a few times, and I actually quite like him. There are some very good Indians. So when I talk
Oh yeah,
about
I
Indians,
know a lot.
of
I
course,
know a lot of great Indians. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm just talking in general. I'm talking about the vast majority of those people. I'm not talking about isolated cases, and you can find isolated good cases from every country and every religion, every place. The what we have been so far talking about is the main flow of future in these third world countries. Vivek Ramaswamy comes across as a very well balanced, nice guy. I would disagree completely with a few of his things. I was actually just reading something about him this morning, and I can't remember exactly, but he does say in one of his speeches that he wants to stop doing business with China, and I think that's a crazy idea. Some of the things again, he was apparently applauding Modi when Modi gave his speech in Washington. So I can ignore some of those things, but the main thrust of his opinion is aligned with mine. And I think if he could become the president or vice president, he would make a very, very positive difference to America. But I don't know if he will become that or not.
Yeah, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but I'm glad he's in the conversation. I'm glad some of these. It seems like we've got a better. I I don't know, but maybe we are better off. I should have gotten back to the Middle East, but what do you think about Turkey?
Chris, I have been to Turkey many times. I absolutely love Turkey. Istanbul is probably among the most beautiful cities on the planet. Um,
Yeah.
Turkey is, and Turkey again shows you that civilization under Islamic control is possible. And my Turkish friends who left Turkey are actually, a couple of them are returning back to Turkey. Now, I know the Western media wants to project that everything has gone downhill in Turkey over the last few years, but that might not necessarily be the case. Turkish, at one point of time, Turkish acted in a very uncivilized way, at least in terms of traffic. And one day, apparently, suddenly everything changed. People now drive much better. The institutions seem to work much better in Turkey. Now, of course, their currency has fallen a lot, and there are a lot of disagreements between the Western countries and Turkish presidents who seem to have some crazy views. But Turkey, you can have a very good view on Turkey. I work with companies who use Turkish construction and infrastructural companies for their worldwide purposes. And they consistently tell me that Turkish construction companies are and infrastructure companies and engineers are among the very best in the world, as good as Chinese are or as good as some of the best in the Western world. So you can have a lot of hopes in Turkey. Turkey is a second world country, and it is still a very European place in many ways.
Yeah, of course you have Istanbul, which has. I mean, it's got to be worth going there just for all the history. Yeah.
Yes, and again, I don't want to give an impression that I have any love for Islam, Chris, but I have to say what I see, and Turkey is something that I enjoy, and I have liked being in Turkey. It's a good place, and I've uh, traveled across Turkey.
Yeah. Certainly. Yeah, you haven't been to Australia or New Zealand recently, have you?
Well, until 2 years back, I mean, see, all traveling was disrupted by
Yeah.
COVID. but I'm now closer in many ways. When I spend my time in East Asia, I'm closer to Australia and New Zealand than I am to North America. I quite like Australia and New Zealand. They are lovely places. They give me the same feeling that I get in North America. The people are very similar in many ways, and the open spaces give me a feeling of liberty that I get in North America.
I'm hearing that a lot of people are leaving both countries though after what happened.
They should. They
Yeah.
should. You should. But you should also be leaving North America by the same using the same yardstick, because the problem with the Western society is that it has taken the path of wokeism, and New Zealand and Australia are becoming increasingly woke. These people are very disconnected from about an understanding of different cultures, and they are bringing in those people without really understanding the cultural influence those immigrants will have on the future of their countries, and they are freely giving away their passports. So demographically, the Western societies is rapidly destroying itself, and exactly why, Chris, I prefer to spend a lot of time in East Asia, because they are homogeneous places. So yes, New Zealand and Australia are becoming very woke. They have seen prosperity for too long. They have gone through the process of political correctness, which means a distance from wisdom and understanding of the world, for many decades. So they have become very simplistic in their thinking, at least in terms of world cultures, and that is leading them to political decisions that are suicidal, not just for Kiwis and Aussies, but also for the rest of the Western society.
Yeah.
I can't think of any European society that is doing the right thing demographically. They are all importing massive number of immigrants. Canada is probably doing the worst thing. They brought in 1 million people in Canada last year in 2022, on a population which is only about 39 million people. When I moved to Canada in 2003, the population of Canada was 29 million people. So, they added 2.5% of their population through immigrants last year. It's crazy, absolutely mind-boggling and crazy and stupid.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the things that I think really bothers me about the West, and especially in America, is how the decline. First of all, America is no longer a marriage culture; it's a divorce culture. But there's also this, and I think maybe this does tie into wokeism, but this whole attitude of child proofing everything and growing up with things, everybody having to be safe and really extending childhood. I mean, my grandfather walked 2 miles to school each way as a 6-year-old, and today people say you can't let your kid do that. And literally we have, and it's becoming now impossible to let your kids do things on their own, or and I mean I would not want to get married and have a family in America just because of how.
Well, Chris, it's funny. If you come to East Asia, if you come to Tokyo, for example, or if you come to Taiwan or Singapore or Hong Kong, you will be among old people and young people and babies and kids all over across you. And they would be walking around you by themselves. A 4-year-old kid being by himself is not an abnormal thing. A 16-year-old girl being out in her mini shorts at 2 o'clock in the night is not a problem in these countries. And when I go to a coffee shop in North America, I can assume that I would be among young adults and no babies and no very old people. Here in East Asia, I can see 80-year-old people who can't walk straight, cleaning up tables. They work in big companies as janitors. There are babies and children all over. They are as much a part of society. The society is not segregated based on your age and age in these countries. You are mixed up with all those people, and children walk around by themselves, unafraid of traffic running over them, or they, unafraid of getting stuck among pedophiles or whatever.
Yeah. Well, in Peru, you can see kids that are maybe 6 years old rowing a canoe down the river, and some of these are big rivers, and they're not wearing life jackets.
Well, Chris, if you look at some of the greatest philosophers, some of the greatest writers, some of the greatest colonizers of the last century, of 2 centuries back, they did most of their accomplishments when they were in their teens or in their 20s. You hardly heard of anyone is starting to accomplish things in their 30s. Now we don't even get started until when we are in our late 20s. So the whole educational system is so fake. It distances us from the realities of life. 14-year-old kids used to commandeer ships in the past. No longer do they do this. So
certainly, yeah. Yeah, is there any way we can turn our maybe bring would you consider yourself more Aristotelian or Platonist?
It's hard for me to distinguish between the two from my perspective. Can you define the two very briefly?
Aristotle is more individualistic. Plato is more collectivist. But there's a little more to it than that. But
I think there's a lot to it. I think I don't want to impose my views on other people. From that point of view, I'm a very individualistic person. But at the same time, I think an individual should think about the larger society. So, from that point of view, one should be collectivist, which means that you should think about the future for your next generation and for the larger society. So, I think the words have create a lot of confusion, but the social rules should be about individualism, which means that you have the freedom to do what you want to do, but the social opprobrium and then the religion and the culture should be such that you should be thinking about the society, or you would face ostracism. I think what we have increasingly in the West is that you don't get ostracized for doing drugs or being single mothers or participating in pedophilia, or what I would call this pride parades. We actually celebrate those, but so I think you really have to have a perspective on these words. I'm a mixture of both if we use different definitions.
Certainly, yeah, it's going to be interesting. I don't know. Have you been back to the Caucasus region, like Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Sakartvelo lately?
Not for a long time. Not for a long time. The last time I was in Armenia was probably about 10 years back. I haven't been back since then.
That's a lovely area, though. It seems like that's a place that's really looking more toward the West, and I don't think they're infected with some of the woke virus because.
Well, so, the Middle Eastern, and I see Armenia as more as Iran, northern part of Iran. And, of course, the religion is different, which actually gives it some extra benefits. You should be optimistic about these people. And that's why, Chris, when I look 10 or 20 years from now, I think East Asia will probably be among the best places. And ironically, for reasons different from Islam, but some of the Middle Eastern countries and places like Armenia might emerge as the second best, while West will have destroyed itself over the next couple of decades.
Yeah, I certainly, when I was in Tbilisi, last year, August, I saw a lot of optimism, but I still hear things like, if you leave your laptop in a cab, the taxi driver will come look for you and stuff like that. I mean, which I think.
I think
that reflects a very healthy society.
Well, which is actually, I'm currently in Japan, Chris, and I tell you, I do it all the time. When I am in North America and if I'm in a coffee shop, I tell someone to look after my laptop and I go to the washroom.
Yeah.
Not here. You just go. I mean, this is not even a thought that happens. In these countries, women put their wallets on the food court tables before they go buying their food and come back 15 minutes later to find their wallets and purses right there to reserve their places. Crime is unthought of in these countries. And my guess, when I was traveling in Scandinavia, in Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, in late 90s, the culture was very similar. You could just leave anything wherever, you would find it a few hours later. Things have changed drastically. I mean, I was shocked when I was in Malmo 3 or 4 years back. Sweden was a place where you never thought about where you could or couldn't go. Now you have to be aware of where you can't go. There are there are no entry places now in many parts of Sweden today.
Yeah, I had a wonderful Brazilian friend who unfortunately left a year ago, but somebody pointed out, said he was from Brazil, and he put his name on everything, and he was always locking things up. And I'm just thinking, what does that say about where you come, about how you?
Yeah, and I do the same thing. Because my Indian instincts refuse to leave me. I lock everything. I never lose anything because I'm so careful about everything. But I should have loosened up in the West. My 15 years of life in the West did not loosen me enough. And that is why I think your culture, the instincts of the culture that you grew up in, stay with you for generations. And in East Asia, where I sometimes I leave my laptop in coffee shops all the time, but I'm always I'm sort of hurrying up from the washroom back, whereas you shouldn't be in East Asia. But then when I go back to North America, I have to be very careful that I protect my back pocket, my wallet, and I tell someone when I go to the washroom in a coffee shop.
Sometimes I think I ought to just take 2 weeks and go to Japan, go to South Korea, and go to Taiwan, and just visit all three of them, because they sound like they're just amazing.
Also go to China, because there's so much of propaganda about China. China is 100,000 times better than what the media in the West portrays it to be. It's a country that is growing and developing so rapidly and improving so rapidly.
I will, and I do say this from personal experience. I came back from Mongolia and I changed planes in Beijing, and I must have been asked to show my passport 5 or 6 times. That did not sit well with me. I mean, and I've changed planes twice in Istanbul. So I never entered Turkey, but I think the only time I had to show anybody my passport was when I was getting on the next plane. Right. So China, that just bothered me, because it said, is this some surveillance state where I'm having to show my passport all the time?
Sorry, that was happening in China for you?
That happened in China, in the airport in Beijing. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Airports will check your passport for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I had my passport checked once in Istanbul, just for a plane change.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, Chinese airports will check your passports. So these are not perfect societies by any measure. No society is perfect. You do have more concept of national identity and ID cards, as is the case in Germany as well, actually. I mean, a lot of continental Europe has the same ID problems. In Germany, you are required to carry your ID. I don't know if you know about it, but you from what I know, you can be arrested for not showing your ID when asked for it. I have been asked by the police, a random guy, ununiformed police in Munich, for my passport. So and I don't like it. They are repulsive measures, but ID is again, remember, East Asia is initially the seed of East Asian changes came from Germany. So they have some of the similar ways of running their institutions.
Yeah, I've been to Munich, so I did spend some time in Germany. I don't really remember ever being asked for my passport in Munich. I can't remember that much, so, but just because it was in China, I mean, because it was, it was 5 or 6 times in the period of 2 or 3 hours, that seemed rather excessive.
Well, which is strange. I have never been asked for my passport except for checking into hotels or just the routine checks at airports in China that I usually go through everywhere else in the world. In fact, I find actually Chinese airports more convenient and more hassle-free compared to North American airports, because the security is flawless and very quick and rapid.
Oh yeah. Oh, North American airports are horrible. I will grant you that.
So
Yes.
there's nothing like TSA in China. They do a quick job. You don't line up for hours, and it's just ABC kind of routine. And if you go to Singapore and Hong Kong, you find something even more interesting. In Singapore, you can get to your gate within 5 minutes of arrival at airports. The immigration is quick, and then you get to the airport, and then you go through the security.
Yeah.
There's no security beforehand. So
Yeah.
the thing with East Asia is that people, although they copied and pasted a lot of good things, a lot of institutions and ways of living from Europe, you can't really underpin it with Western philosophy, really. And
Yes.
the Western philosophy never got underpinned in these societies, and that is what I find lacking in East Asia, which makes me fearful of it as well.
Well, as you were talking about Singapore Airport has no domestic flights, right? Yeah, I mean they're all international flights in and out of Singapore.
Well, I mean, Singapore is such a small place that you
Yeah.
can drive from the one furthest east of Singapore to the west of Singapore in less than half an hour. It's it's a city state. It's a small place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of any place I've been though where in an airport that had no domestic flights, and I don't think I've ever been to an airport like that. I mean,
well, Hong Kong is similar. Hong Kong is
Hong Kong,
similar.
Yes, Hong Kong. Yeah.
Yeah. Macau is similar, but yeah, I mean, this is just a dot on the map. I mean, it's Hong Kong, Singapore, Macau. They are dots on the map.
Yeah.
But Singapore, despite being just a small dot with a small population of 4-5 million people, is so influential because of the kind of institutions and the kind of regime that they have created. By no means perfect. All governments are by definition imperfect, but it is probably one of the best run countries on the planet.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have anything else you want to say before we go? Tell people where your website are, where they can find you.
My website is
coming up. Yep.
Yeah, well, let's talk about two things then. My website is jayantbhandari.com, and I run a yearly philosophy seminar in Vancouver. The next one is on the 9th of September, 2023 in downtown Vancouver, Canada. And this seminar attracts some of the best brains, some of the best liberty-oriented, non-woke brains to give their speeches, and it's a wonderful day. I invite you to come and participate in that seminar. People like Amy Wax, you might have heard of Amy Wax. She's a keynote speaker. Maxime Bernier, who I consider to be the Ron Paul of Canada, is a speaker. Adrian Day, Jeff Deist, who was until recently the head of Mises Institute in Alabama. So these are the kind of people who come to seminar. You can see a tab on my website that takes you to the registration, and if you use coupon code Baker, I will make sure it is triggered by the time you upload this video. I will offer 10% discount to anyone who wants to register for the seminar, so they can use BAKER as the coupon code.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be of service in that. It's and getting into Canada is no issue, right? Right. I mean, if you're a foreigner wanting to enter Canada, it's just like it was in 2019.
All the COVID craziness is gone from what I know everywhere in the world. The world is an open place. No one checks for your vaccination or boosters. I think Japan is probably the only place which still claims it checks for it, but it doesn't. But that's the situation.
Yeah, that's good to know. You know, of course, some other changes. The biggest change I've noticed as a result of the Corona stuff is just customer service everywhere has went downhill so far. But yeah. But anyway,
not so much in East Asia. East Asia is very, very competitive, Chris. In my understanding, East Asia is the only place, particularly Hong Kong, where salaries actually can fall depending on changing economic situation. These are very competitive places. You go out of business, out of your job very quickly if your demeanor is not good, if you're not good service provider. These are very competitive societies, and they do this job perfectly well without the need for overregulation. And that's why I think I go back to your earlier statement. Everyone should visit places like Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong, and China, even today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been great having you. Please follow the channel, subscribe to the channel, like the video, give it a thumbs up. We're on BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, and YouTube right now. And buy my novel, Escape from the Village. I'm Chris Baker, and we're out. Thank you.